Winnipeg might finally be a sexy destination if Gabriel Vilardi's contract comments are anything to go by.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we are chatting a little bit about some of the current off-season stuff. Been a little bit quiet around Winnipeg after the massive deal for Gabriel Vilardi. We are still waiting for a couple of big contracts, and, obviously KFC is probably one of the bigger ones, but we're also anticipating Dylan Samberg getting done very soon, and I would think Samberg has to come in the next week or so. But of course, one of the things that came out of Vilardi's contract was that he was chatting with some folks in the media and was talking about, Winnipeg kind of becoming home to him now. Is this a sign that maybe the perception around coming to the Jets is starting to shift? I want to talk about that in a brief second, but before we do, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, like I said, the Jets are obviously in a city that is, well, for lack of a better way to describe it, not exactly the most desirable location for a lot of players. I think over the years we've seen the Jets really try for guys who have no trade clauses, which is, quite a bit of the league. But I think the biggest problem with that is when you're going with guys who either are on some sort of a modified no movement or no trade clause, or you're even, maybe you're even going for an RFA like Nietzsche's, who does exercise some control about his next destination. It can be a little tricky to recruit players to come to the Jets. You have to convince them to re-sign. You have to convince them that this is a good destination. And for a lot of guys with families and stuff, I think that's usually been a little bit tricky. But I think the Jets are starting to change some of that because of how well the team is doing. And Vilardi came here sort of, in a situation where there was a bit of a scene change. Obviously, his stint in LA was relatively short, partly because it just took him a while to make the pros. He got hurt a lot. He had some very big surgeries and injuries to deal with, and there was no real guarantee that he'd have a big pro career. But once he got to Winnipeg and he started playing here for the last year and a half, it's been a very eventful time for him. He's found himself on a first line. He's got a team that's really closely knit and close in the locker room. You've got a team that has just won a President's Trophy, and he's given prime deployments on the power play. So in many ways, things have really come up all things Vilardi. And he described, coming to this team and having played here as it becoming a bit of a home for him. Now, I've heard interesting stories about maybe his partner not being quite as fond of the city in some ways, but that's just part of the territory, right? And it seems like she has also agreed that, Winnipeg is a good place to spend some time, and they are both in agreement, seemingly, that this is where they want to spend their next 6 years. Obviously, there's a chance that maybe he has to leave, and maybe there's something that happens and he needs to have a change of scenery, but from all accounts, Winnipeg seems to have locked him up for the foreseeable future. And in that respect, I think in some ways people often look at recruiting towards Winnipeg as really the biggest hurdle. And I think it's partly because the Jets maybe aren't targeting the right players. When they do have an opportunity to bring in a big fish, sometimes I feel like they're a little reticent to spend big assets. I think that there is a fear that maybe these guys don't want to stay around and that they're not going to commit to the Jets and that they can't change that perception. But I think when we see all of these guys who have been re-upping recently, in my mind, once you get them here, I don't think that that's as much of a problem as it used to be. Pionk has signed long-term and arguably a bit under market compared to what he could get out in free agency. Vilardi has signed a relatively friendly contract for both parties. Obviously, there is some injury risk with him, but 6 years, $7.5 million, that's really, really good for both sides. Then you've got Scheifele and Hellebuck signing, their long-term deals without trade protection. You've got some other guys who have recently re-upped. Iafallo has re-signed. Nemesnikov signed a bit ago. So to me, I think sometimes the narrative is a little bit overstated. Guys may not want to play here or get drafted here necessarily, but I think that there's kind of this push towards winning being a really big bombing agent over some of this, right? You want to have something that's maybe a little bit soothing. And if you're a really successful organization, I think that's how you start to really change hearts and minds. Show that you have a winning pedigree, convince people that what you're doing here, whether it's in the fanciest city or not, is really effective and really working. And I think the rest will start to fall in place. Guys are going to want to start really playing here. And I think the way that the Jets have also been drafting recently has kind of, in my mind, built an interesting future core of players who seem like they're going to be players that Winnipeg will love, and that these are guys who would actually play for Winnipeg. I look at Kevin He, I look at Barlow, I look at Martin, of course, who just got drafted. A lot of these guys seem like they would be more than willing to suit up for the Jets. And, obviously the McGroarty thing maybe didn't work out so well, but Yeager coming in exchange for him, you got a guy who looks like he's ready to really hit the ground running with the Jets and really thrive. And so for me, I'm starting to really change my perception around what is keeping the Jets from recruiting these guys. I think Winnipeg needs to just target different kinds of players. Maybe look at younger guys who are, perhaps RFAs. Obviously, they do still have a chance to pick their next destination, but if you can convince them to maybe take a 1 or 2 year deal, let them play here, let them see what it's like, and maybe that's a way to start to work around this. I talked a little bit about this with respect to McTavish. Obviously, you would really like to get guys locked up for the long term, and that's the most ideal situation for the Jets. But if you're a team that maybe has some recruiting challenges, maybe you need to be more open about how you approach this. And if you get 1 to 2 good seasons out of a player and then you have to trade them, I don't know if that's necessarily the worst. You don't really want a revolving cast next necessarily, but here's the thing, right? If it doesn't work out, you can probably turn said RFA into a really big trade package, and maybe, you can get the next player who's really likely to commit to the Jets long term. Lots of guys are eager to move to other places. We see that a lot recently, and I think the Jets can be an interesting destination. That's again a team that just won a President's Trophy, that has really purged out a lot of the toxic locker room culture and built a very strong family, tight knit community. And so I just feel like, I wouldn't call Winnipeg the sexiest destination. There are other, cost of living things, not necessarily in the price, but certainly in the quality of the education system, all that stuff that you have to kind of factor into all of this. But if the Jets start to maybe identify different players who are looking for a change of scenery, and maybe it's not a situation where the city itself is a problem, this might be the way to go forward. You don't have to go for guys like Brock Nelson who have trade protection and who turned the Jets down. It's a good thing that he did, apparently, because he wasn't that great for the Avs. But I look elsewhere and I think about, maybe guys like Kakko who perhaps would have been willing to come to the Jets. Kakko just inked a new deal with Seattle, and that's a pretty big money contract. Not a super long one, though. And I think about the value that he's provided them. I look at guys like, maybe you have a chance to try and swing on a Heedle or something, guys who are, maybe dealing with some cosmetic stuff. With Heedle, obviously he had some other issues. The concussion thing was a big problem, but I think the Jets really can build an intriguing group of players with additions from the outside, from maybe guys who are not as unwilling to come to Winnipeg as folks think. It's just really finding that fit and really showing them what this team and city can be. I think that's the biggest thing. I think it would make a really big difference. And hopefully, as the Jets continue to build a successful winning culture, that really starts to bleed into the Jets being an attractive destination. Curious to know how you feel about this. Do you think that this is maybe a shifting perception? Do you think it's something that's going to continue? Drop your thoughts on that in the comments below or at my social medias at HL Living Loco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Now, speaking of getting guys to commit, perhaps one of the biggest contracts in Jets history is really sort of in the works. We haven't really heard a lot about it. We've heard some rumors. We've seen a lot of speculation, but Kyle Connor is likely to ink a deal sometime in the next month or so. I want to chat about that contract price and what this could mean for all involved in just a brief moment. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends and family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you just want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without all the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, and even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes all of it possible. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices actually on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. I used it buying Baltimore Ravens playoff tickets. Very convenient. I saw exactly where I was sitting, got a nice panoramic seat view, very convenient, and the prices were up front, so I didn't get hit with surprise charges. If, like me, you want to take the guesswork out of buying tickets, go with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about whether or not the Jets have become a sexy destination and how that is playing into some of the current contract negotiations with some of our biggest free agents. Now, one of the biggest ones in franchise history is sort of out there. It's not exactly one that I think we've heard a ton about, but Frank Seravalli was talking about it earlier today. And Seravalli, I wouldn't call him an insider in the same way that I think Friedman is now, but Fridge has obviously spoken a little bit about this as well. KFC seems like he wants to re-up, and for the Jets, this is a huge priority. I would argue that the KFC deal is probably on par with the Scheifele and Hellebuck extensions in terms of importance, just because obviously KFC is one of our biggest goal scorers and certainly one of the most talented forwards on the team. There's been a lot of debate over the last couple of years about what his value to the team is, and obviously I kind of sit a bit on the fence. For me, KFC, if we get the version of him that he was this past year under Arneal's new system, you don't really worry about the contract price too much. He will be worth the money. You got nearly a 100-point season out of him where he was actually putting up pretty good two-way results, partly because he just started back-checking for the first time. Even if he does it like 1 out of every 3 or 4 times, that's a big improvement over not doing it at all. And that had a really tangible impact on his transition game and his offense, which finally made him like a really complete first-line forward. The risk with him is that as his skating starts to slow down, you do wonder how much of that game is going to keep coming back. And, how likely is it that he's going to repeat this past season in terms of his overall impact? The points are obviously great, but I think the biggest thing for me is just making sure that he's still doing a lot of the good two-way habits that he was building this past season. So that puts his contract in a very interesting light. How much would it be? Seravalli speculates in the $11 to $12 million range. I've talked about this being in the $12 million range. I think if it's anything under 12, you are probably pretty happy about that. Obviously, you might have some misgivings about how the top 9 is going to continue to be arranged with him in it. And I can't say that I don't share some of those concerns. Obviously, the Jets' first line really does need an overhaul. And for whatever reason, Winnipeg is just the one team in the league that doesn't seem to want to experiment with that. Literally the one team. I've never seen a Jets team or really an NHL team that's been so committed to a top line quite like this one. But that aside, in terms of KFC, the player, he is a very expensive guy. In a perfect world, maybe you would have gotten him at like 10.5 or 11 million a while back. But this is kind of like, the past several years, he's been on the $7.5 million contract, pretty fair for what you get out of him. And I think this next deal is really going to lock in this current core in top 6. And I do hope that, if that is the case, that maybe they get a little bit creative with how they arrange it. I think the Jets have really been hell-bent on keeping things as they are, and I just don't understand that at times. I feel like Winnipeg really needs to go back to the drawing board about what made, previous teams really successful. The top line, even under Maurice, occasionally saw more changes than we've seen the past couple of years. And I think that needs to be a thing that the Jets do a little more often. Now that Arniel has the trust of the team in the room, I feel like he should feel a little more in control of being able to make those changes. That's if he wants to make them. He may not necessarily think it's a problem. I don't quite know what his assessment is, but I do feel like the Jets in general are going to have, an older and slower team this year. And for me, that sort of necessitates maybe rearranging some stuff. The way that you've got it right now is decent, but I think we've seen about the ceiling of this team and what it was able to accomplish. President's Trophy, phenomenal. Winning your division, phenomenal. 6 playoff game wins, less phenomenal. And I think we saw such a difference in levels when you looked at where the Jets were and who won the cup. And that's not just the thing that's happened to the Jets, right? We saw Edmonton and Dallas get humbled too. So, it doesn't mean that anything the Jets do, any changes that they make are necessarily going to be successful. But when you're in such a gauntlet of a division and you have a very difficult marathon to run to get to the cup finals, you got to give yourself as many chances as you can. It's one thing if Winnipeg exhausted every opportunity and got themselves in that spot, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And so if you lock up KFC here, you really need to be considering a swing. I think at that point, you are really committing to a core group of like 4 or 5 guys, and you need to make sure that you are giving them the best chance to win possible. Whether that's trying to acquire a Mason McTavish or something, that's certainly up for debate. I think the drafting side of things has gotten better, and I think the way that the Jets are approaching a lot of very projectable NHLers, some of them with real upside, makes a ton of sense. Guys who you could probably convince to play, guys who are likely to sign their ELCs pretty soon. We have already got Kevin under contract, so I think that there's a really good future core that's coming, but you want them to more fill in those depth roles because that's probably where they're going to cap out at. It's very hard for a lot of young players to make a considerable impact at the NHL level. Just look at how hard it's been for Lambert and Cherbrikov to really make the team consistently. So going forward, I do hope that with KFC's contract, which feels inevitable, right, that they're a little more open to experimentation. If you can think more about the pairings and how you can make the most out of your top 9, this Jets team is going to have a very different approach at 5v5. I still think that there's a version of this team that we have yet to see that is really playoff capable and a much stronger out. A tough team to beat, even harder than it was this year. The Jets, to be realistic, almost lost in the first round, right? And I think we want to avoid that going forward. Some of that, Hellebuyck is just going to have to be better, but we also saw that the Jets at times struggled to create offense, and I think that that's something, more consistently that we want to see with this team. So as we kind of near this big KFC deal, I'm wondering what the Jets see as their next evolution. What do they think of this current team? Are they just going to try and run it back? The fact that they've not really done a lot other than a couple of UFA acquisitions and an extension or two tells me that they're not really feeling like this year is going to be the year to make the push. If it happens, right? And maybe they'll have some room at the TDL to spend. But it doesn't seem like, at least on the face of it, they're really looking at this season as the one. And so, they're trying to get these extensions done. It'll map out their future a little more clearly. But at least for next season, it doesn't feel like they are super, super invested into throwing a lot of assets into it yet. So something to keep an eye on. KFC, we've never really heard that he doesn't have any intention of signing. I would expect the contract coming up pretty soon. I can guarantee you that the Jets will not go into the season without a deal in place, but I think that they'll get it done. If they can get him locked up at like 11.5 by 8, great. Get it done. That's fine. Whatever concerns I may have, we know how the Jets are. We know that they like to keep their guys. Connor loves playing in Winnipeg. He's very close friends with a lot of the core of the team. He's a pretty good player himself, and if he continues to play like he has under Arniel so far, you really don't worry about it. So hopefully that continues. Hope he continues to put up really big results. Would love to see him hit that 100-point milestone and maybe even compete for a Rocket Richard, but would love to know your thoughts on that. What his next contract's going to be. How are you feeling about it? Do you still think the Jets should trade him? Drop those comments and thoughts below or at my social media at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Our last guy to talk about is not really anyone that's a surprise, but of course, Dylan Samberg still needs a deal, and that contract is probably coming in the next week or so. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's show as we're just closing out with some thoughts on, obviously, a lot of the extensions that are starting to roll in. We've had a big one with Vilardi last week, making Winnipeg a sexy destination. We've heard some speculation about KFC and the AAV on his next deal. Samberg, for some reason, I don't really hear as much about him in the NHL media, which is very funny because you'd argue that he's probably like a top 5 most important player on the team. He doesn't get talked about it by many people, but the really smart stats folks know, and we've all seen it. We know that Samberg is arguably a cornerstone of this franchise. He's kind of, in my mind, become on the level of Morrissey in terms of importance to this team. When he was gone, the Jets were a 500 team. So, yeah, Winnipeg has to have Samberg. He's a game changer at 5v5. He's a huge special teams player. He is really one of the linchpins on the back end that keeps this whole squad and team's defensive structure in place, because he also keeps maybe some of the lesser defenders a little bit further down the lineup. But his next contract isn't going to be that crazy. I would think that he's getting like a 6 or 7 year deal, probably in the $6 million range. I don't think it's going to be much more than $6 million if it is. Maybe Gavrikov or some of these other guys got a bit more in free agency. I just don't think that Samberg's necessarily going to go that high. If it is in the $7 million range, that'd be pretty crazy. Not that I would be mad about it, but I would be a little shocked. I don't see that being the case. I don't think it's going to happen. Not for a guy who's ostensibly playing as your number 2 behind Morrissey. I still think 6 is probably the number, but in terms of what that's also going to mean for the Jets' blue line, Winnipeg obviously has quite a few guys now locked up, but we are starting to see DeMello really decline rapidly. Pionk, I don't quite know how long he's going to be able to keep up with Samberg. He's not young anymore. He's like 29 or 30 now. And as his skating starts to decline, you'll start to want to look at some of the younger blue liners to step in and make a real impact. And obviously, I think the org is really high on Salamonson. So, going forward, your top pairing of Morrissey and Salamonson does feel like in maybe 2 years that could be a thing. Dylan's definitely slowing down, so his replacement seems pretty lock and key. Samberg with Pionk probably locked up for the foreseeable future. Hopefully, as soon as the end of this week or maybe even early next week. And then the third pairing, we just have no idea, right? The third pairing is all over the place. It could be almost anything at this point. I don't think the Jets really know themselves. They've cycled like 3 or 4 different guys on there. You've had Fleury extended. You have Miller still for 1 more year at least. They just keep bringing guys in and trying to figure something out. Even Stanley, they've tried to make happen. So the Jets' decor is solid, and I think in some ways, we talk a lot about the Jets needing to bring in a big defender, and I don't know if I quite see it that way as much. I think the biggest thing for Winnipeg is once you get KFC and Samberg locked up, you've got to chase that big center, right? I really feel like the Jets forward group needs that skill injection. I don't quite know how easy that's going to be to pull off. You've got to find somebody who's maybe a little more disgruntled or maybe on the outs with their current org, but has an underlying profile that projects to be really good, and try and lure him in. McTavish, I think, if he's really wanting out, is a perfect target. Rossi definitely has some cosmetic issues, and I think that he's a little bit of a trickier situation, but the Jets clearly don't care about the foot speed thing, so I don't think about that. His size, maybe that would be a bit of a hindrance, but having watched Rossi and the way that he plays, I think people will be a little bit surprised at just how impetuous and feisty he is. He's, for his size, he's very good at finding soft spaces, and that's why he's been, a 50 to 60 point guy within the past year or so. All these guys who are looking for new homes and who are kind of on the outs, I really feel like this is a chance for the Jets to really upgrade the forward group. Taves could be decent, but, again, you're asking like a nearly 40-year-old, 2 years out of the league to do something special. Probably not the best plan. Lowry's getting older, and, with his hip surgery, we don't know what that's going to look like. The players that they've signed in free agency, Koepka's like the youngest one at like 27-ish, 28. Nyquist and Pearson are certainly over 30. And so Winnipeg has, in my mind, some urgency to find some younger players. Now, I hope that they make some space for Lambert and Chibrikov to really earn roles this year. Lambert, especially, I think, needs some room to breathe. I kind of know what Chibrikov's going to be. I think he's going to be a really solid middle six guy. Lambert, we still just don't know. He's kind of a mystery box. But, once we have some of these contract extensions in place, that'll give the Jets a pretty clear picture of what they can do with the remaining cap space. And if they choose to look at this as a situation where you signed your free agents, you got them locked up, now it's time for a transition year to see what you need after the season, I can understand that. Maybe Winnipeg sort of sees the writing on the wall of what the Panthers just did, and they're like, yeah, we need to do some other stuff to really reach that level. And so this year's kind of a write-off, but they're not going to just throw in the towel. They're going to softly retool and do it quietly. That's kind of the impression that I've got this offseason. You take care of business with Vilardi, Samberg, and KFC, and then sort of, let God sort out the rest, so to speak. Hopefully that sorting out leads to a good playoff run, but I do think that this year is a little bit less important to the Jets in their minds as a competitive season, but they have the room to add if things go really well. You roll into March and you're in a good playoff spot, you'll have space to bring in a big acquisition. And if somebody really does fall out of favor and suddenly the Jets are in pole position to land a McTavish or something, you're having a very different outlook on the season. So I appreciate that there's a lot of flexibility. I would expect the Jets to have around $4 million in cap space after the Samberg deal comes in, maybe a bit more than that. Not a ton though, enough to where you'd probably have to move out salary if you want to bring in a big acquisition, but more than likely it's going to limit it to TDL moves for the most part. So interesting stuff for the Jets. This is a very curious offseason, one that I wasn't really sure what to expect from, just because Winnipeg. It's sometimes hard to know if they know why they've been successful or why they've fallen short. And there are signs that maybe they're starting to change some of their assessments of how things are done, but there are still some old-fashioned Winnipeg things. Running it back is kind of a big thing with this team because it usually guarantees you some sort of playoff revenue. So now that they've had a big President's Trophy run and a really frustrating playoff exit with a lot of emotional fatigue out of that, I wonder how they're going to try and frame this upcoming season. For me, this could be the year that I expected last year, a year of transition. And I think for the Jets, that really wouldn't be the worst thing. So curious to know if you're in line with a transition year. Would you want kind of this soft retool? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, hopefully with a Dylan Samberg extension announcement.